What's up, comrades? Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. All aboard the Todd McGowan train for part 4 of Capitalism and Desire, the Psychic Cost of Free Markets. CC Alex is still in the driver's seat for this one, and we are going to focus on sacrifice in capitalism. This one is very lengthy, it's very dense, so we're just going to jump right into it. But just a couple of things you can look out for in this episode. We're going to talk a lot about sacrifice. A new philosopher, theorist, degenerate named Georges Bataille is going to make his first appearance on the show. We're going to talk a good bit about Bataille as he relates to McGowan's chapter here. We're going to talk about terrorism. We're going to talk about food and all sorts of other good stuff. Before we jump into the episode, let's run down our standard housekeeping items for Red Library every week and just some various ways you can support the show, especially if you're a new listener. Remember that Red Library is part of the Lost Horizons podcasting network, a collection of shows focused on developing a dialectical pessimist perspective on leftist politics and organizing, along with ourselves and The Regrettable Century and From 78. You can find us on our Lost Horizons network feed, where every month we're doing a roundtable discussion focused on lots of different aspects of our own experiences and political views and thinking through of what dialectical pessimism means. So just search Lost Horizons Network on any podcast catcher and you should find us no problem. I want to give a big shout out to all the new Red Library patrons out there. We have had a really just humbling and staggering increase in patrons over the last month or so. We really appreciate all your support, and it is greatly humbling to feel that what we're putting out there is of interest and of value to y'all. If you'd like to become a patron, remember, head over to our Patreon page. You can find a link down in the show notes for this episode, and for as little as $1 a month, that's roughly a quarter an episode, you can get access to all of our exclusive content. That includes one free exclusive episode per month, our Discord server where you can discuss politics and philosophy and theory with us and a bunch of other patrons. We have a reading group that we just started on Jody Dean's The Communist Horizon. We organize our Red Library Cinema movie nights through there and all sorts of other good stuff. It's a hell of a lot of fun. Remember to like the show on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and last but not least, just keep spreading the show around. Maybe drop some links in some favorite Discord servers, some various Facebook groups, maybe share some things around on Twitter, as we're really trying to build up this dialectical pessimist perspective as a sort of antidote, shining a light on a possible path forward in the political landscape today for those of us on the left. All right, y'all, let's do this damn thing. Here we go. Capitalism and Desire Part 4 with CC Alex leading the show. Enjoy. We'll see you back here afterward. Hey everybody, McGowan, Part 4. Action, adventure, excitement, sacrifice. Let's do
Sacrifice, yes. Sacrifice.
All right, we got the normal crew here. So it's I guess all 3 comrade commissars and then me, the people.
The people. And we give it back to you, the people.
So, I don't know, anything anyone want to touch on from Part 3 on the gays? Neil, I know you had to leave a little bit early, and we talked a little bit about film and some other stuff, which I guess you probably haven't heard that episode yet. But I don't know, any other thing you wanted to throw in or questions you wanted to pose that we didn't get to last time?
No, I feel pretty good about the part that I was involved in last time. I don't know what happened after I left, but you know.
Well, unfortunately, you are responsible whether you were there or not. So.
Ooh. Story of my life, man.
Yeah, story of all of our lives. I guess CC Alex, Comrade Commissar of Degeneracy, you're in the hot seat.
Still in the hot seat?
Yeah.
Still the pilot of the aeroplane.
I mean, it's really kind of running on autopilot, but sure.
Skipper.
I'm the fucking blow up pilot
from Airplane.
But so anyway,
you needed reinflated.
Yeah, I need to be reinflated. I'm severely losing air right now. If we have any Patreon volunteers that want to help with my reinflation.
That is maybe at least the third or fourth time you just made direct sexual advances towards the patrons of our show.
Sorry, man. They just really, I just can't contain it. I just, I love him so much.
I love him too. I can't argue with that.
Last time we were talking about the gays, I guess, mostly. And now, chapter 4, we're moving on to sacrifice and other things. But yeah, a lot of sacrifice. A lot of talk of sacrifice.
Can I just say here that I really love McGowan's opening sentence in this chapter, which is just, capitalism doesn't require the sacrifice of virgins. It's a real strong opening.
Yeah, in no lesser terms, right? Like, we don't have to sacrifice them. We can. We're free to. Free. So anyway, I did air quotes around free. You guys can't see me.
I'll put in the little like noise for the air quote. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So he starts off talking about the first section is called Sacrifice Becoming Secular. And it's, generally speaking, it's about, the way that although we have moved into like an era of secularism, so to speak, and in capitalism today, we don't experience it as like a mystical domain. It's not like, like maybe like a religious organization of society of old. It's not, it's a very, like you could call it rational, maybe, perspective on the world. But at the end of the day, despite not having that mysticism, there's still like a heavy reliance within capitalism on what we would call sacrifice, right? Not in the traditional sense of like, like what Adam talked about, like sacrificing virgins, like the opening sentence, but in a different sense, right? Like, for example, like the source of value, right, is, labor time. And, that in a sense is a sacrifice on behalf of workers in order to be able to make the machine of capital function, right? And there's all different types of sources of that. And he kind of goes into this. But yeah, it's kind of a counterintuitive thought to think of capitalism as still necessitating sacrifice of some kind. And it specifically kind of flies in the face of like the defenders of capitalism that are sort of like these like positivist, like vitalists, kind of that idea of like we participate in capitalism because it like provides material resources and we need to survive off of those things, and it like facilitates that survival. And so he really attacks that in this section. McGowan does.
Can I jump in really fast?
Yeah.
So
please.
I guess just as a setting up and framing of this chapter, I don't know if there's going to be any debate amongst us about this, but it seems that what he's really getting at is that
I could see Don
I feel like
that was directed at me, but
yeah, it was a little side eye at Don there,
sharpening his knife.
But I guess the idea is that usually for systems of capitalism in like modern secular society, we kind of see capitalism being allied very closely with the Enlightenment and the idea that we've overcome the need for superstitious beliefs, which is usually what sacrifice is sort of associated with. So, I mean, I almost see this being like a very Adorno and Horkheimer-esque like sort of approach as well, to say that, in terms of the Enlightenment, like we haven't overcome the need for like myth and superstition. It sort of persists in a new way. And these processes are still happening in capitalism, even though they appear to be, again, like secular, rational, without need of superstitious belief.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that.
Come on, Don, do you have any questions or comments?
I was going to let you guys all speak for at least a half hour before I interject any of my questions. I'll let you guys talk.
Self-mediating.
Yeah, that way it's
He's laying the trap.
Yeah, that way I'm not dominating the discussion with my questions. So you guys continue for a while.
So Neil, can I actually pick your brain about this really quick? So from the sort of psychoanalytic perspective, I guess, do you have any, I don't know, did this bring up any particular thoughts for you about the sort of relationship between rationality and myth from the psychoanalytic perspective? And not necessarily like we need to talk Jung or anything, but I was curious if you wanted to share some thoughts you had about how psychoanalysis will kind of like thinks about this sort of division between like secular and sort of superstitious.
Yeah, so I have a lot of different thoughts on this that I wanted to get into. One is there's a line, actually, I'm trying to find it. It's on page 90, if you want to look at this. And I'll just kind of go from the top of a paragraph here. For many social theorists, however, there's no getting around sacrifice and the sacred. Freud sees the collective sacrifice of individual enjoyment as the foundation of the social order itself. Foundation that subsequent sacrificial rituals commemorate and reaffirm. So he starts here with Freud, and Freud's kind of idea of, from a psychoanalytic idea of sacrifice, I think is super interesting, right? And if people want to know more about this, you can read like Group Analysis and the Ego. I'm probably getting the title wrong here, but it's where Freud really gets into this idea that human beings will kind of give up a lot of what they find individually satisfying in order to kind of like become part of a group. And they'll also do things in a group that they wouldn't do if they were just kind of on their own and all that. So he kind of gets into that right off the bat. But the psychoanalytic link that I think is the most important one is a Lacanian one, and it's the idea of jouissance. I think jouissance is super important to understanding sacrifice. If you want to get sacrifice, I think you kind of have to get jouissance. So without going into a huge like dissertation on jouissance, there's things that we enjoy, like, you know, and there's some things that we enjoy just kind of like they're all right, you know, and there's other things that like jouissance is a French word and doesn't have a particularly good English equivalent, but the closest we come to is it's kind of like what gets us off. So there's certain things that produce a very visceral, very bodily sense of enjoyment. And when we engage in those things, I think typically what we're doing is we are sacrificing our bodies, we're sacrificing our lives, we're sacrificing our time, we're sacrificing things that have value to us. And as we do that, we get this actual physical sensation that is deeply, deeply, deeply enjoyable, but also extremely destructive to us. And that's the thing which is, I think, super important about this. What McGowan, I think, does here is he kind of brings in this psychoanalytic idea that not only do we sacrifice our bodies, our time, our minds to capitalism, but that we enjoy it. Right? There is an enjoyment in doing this. And we could probably say a ton over the next however long this episode is about the reasons for that enjoyment, but that's the big tie-in as I see it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you kind of set off a light in my head just now when you were talking, Neil. I remember thinking about the category of happiness. And I think maybe we've discussed it. I don't know if it was in an episode or just like a discussion we were having one day, but like the category of happiness and how it sort of takes on this strange quality of like being like a formal category almost, that like it's not something that you ever attain necessarily, but it's more like a set of like goals that you hope to achieve. And like happiness just becomes this strange thing that you're willing to sacrifice for all of the time, and you actually end up in like a strange state of like perpetual sacrifice attempting to attain happiness, but it never really arrives, because even when you have all of the sort of qualities or the boxes checked on the like happiness list, you know, you don't necessarily experience it in a direct format. You're still always like a step away from it, kind of. And then there's like the to counter provide an alternative example, like something like joy, right? Where when you're motivated by joy, you're willing to sacrifice all of the things that you would have formerly considered like the qualifications for having happiness, right? To experience the joy, like any kind of like artistic breakthrough or something. You feel like you're like really, really excited about, wanting to write an idea down and like really explore it, and like, you won't sleep, you won't eat, you don't shower, whatever the hell it is that people do in their regular lives outside of quarantine. I guess this is just normal life now. We don't eat, shower, or do anything. But you know what I mean? Like when you're motivated by joy, all of the things that you would normally consider qualifications for your happiness just kind of go out the window, because there's like actual motivation there. It's like direct motivation, as opposed to like this strange carrot that hangs in front of your face that we call happiness, So I don't know, just a thought.
That makes a lot of sense, though. And I guess like there's another thing that you were talking about that kind of came to my mind that maybe gets into what Adam, what you were actually asking me about. But
I already forgot what it was.
You talked about sacrifice from like a secular perspective versus like a non-secular perspective. So the thing about sacrifice is it involves a destruction of something, right? Like what sacrificing is a verb. Something gets destroyed. And what I think is going on is, in the past, people had ways that there's a desire to do this. There's an enjoyment in destruction. And this is sort of like an innate sort of thing that all people have, according to Freud. Freud would say, I think, that desire to, and it's not, I don't want to use the word desire, that drive to destroy things and the enjoyment that it provokes was channeled very effectively through the technology of ritual, right? And it could be like, you're sacrificing things to the jackal-headed god of the dead, or to the, whatever other totem you want to select. And that gave people a receptacle within which they could kind of put that destructive energy and the enjoyment that came with it. And then what happened is, over time, human beings became less spiritual / superstitious / mystical, and became much more rational, logical, and scientific. But the desire to destroy things and the enjoyment that came from destroying them, that was still there. Like, that did not go away when we had the scientific revolutions that we have experienced as a species. That desire remains just as strong as it always has been. It's just now it has to be put into different things, because the kind of like religious stuff, it works for some people still, but it doesn't work for everybody. And so we have things like public executions. I think if we look back at the way that people used to attend those, and there were these huge events, right? Then eventually those were kind of put behind the walls of a prison so that people couldn't make a spectacle of them. And, we have things like sports where, effectively, like, when you are watching a game and like one team is like destroying the other one, that can do something for the players and for the fans and all these things. But anyways, the point I guess I'm trying to make here is that throughout all of human history, there has been an intense jouissance, an intense enjoyment that we have felt when we engage in the process of sacrificial destruction, whatever form it takes.
So I'd like to bring up two things. One, the idea of how sacrifice becomes something secularized and part of everyday life is really interesting, because it starts to take on a lot of forms that you wouldn't necessarily identify or sort of attach the signifier of being sacrificial to. So one of the more interesting examples I've heard discussed, and I wish I could remember where this was, but it was the idea of how whenever a celebrity does something scandalous, or something happens with some sort of celebrity that we like place on this pedestal, and we like invest them with this sort of almost like sacred kind of quality, part of what is so enjoyable whenever they fuck up is that we get to sort of like tear them down and destroy them in this kind of sacrificial way. And there is like an intense jouissance about that. Yeah. I also, and this is a bit of a stretch, but I do wonder if there's some element of like canceling people and like, like that kind of element, which also has this like destructive like pleasure that comes with it. And that's part of, I think, why that sort of as like a like social cultural practice like can be so intense and so, I think, like shocking and like so like violent how it occurs, is because like it's this element of like we're sacrificing, a member of our group, a member of someone who we felt really close to. And there's this element of it that I think, you never identify it as such, but I absolutely think that's part of what's going on. Yeah. So the second thing I want to bring up, and maybe we can kind of jump off of this. This is a little bit further down than the paragraph you read, Neil, but I think it's a really good...
the Hegel, where he talks about Hegel.
Actually, I was not going to do the Hegel part. I was going to skip down a little bit further, but we can come back to that for sure. But I thought this was a good summary of what McGowan is saying, and I want to tie this to our a couple of chapters ago too. He says, sacrifice survives within capitalism, though its form of appearance undergoes a complete overhaul. Sacrifice migrates from the transcendent side of the ritual into everyday life. This migration of sacrifice from the sacred realm to the everyday has the effect of rendering sacrifice common and simultaneously making it seem a thing of the past. I was actually thinking about our chapter on private and public and the shifting of those two sorts of realms of experience under capitalism. And I was curious what y'all make of connecting these two chapters together. Is there a way that the more that like capitalism sort of colonizes things as like private spaces and like increases the realm of the private, is there also a way that like sacrifice being an everyday thing has to be pushed into that realm as well? I'm not really sure what the connection could be, but I'm wondering if these are like sort of corresponding like features of capitalism's development in terms of like the social realm of like how we experience day-to-day life. It's like, do we then make sacrifice more every day the more that everything becomes private? And if so, like I don't know how to think through that connection, if there is one.
McGowan definitely like addresses that directly. I'm trying to see if there's a good quote I can pull out of this paragraph here. He kind of talks about it at the top of 92. Mm-hmm. He's saying, it's kind of in the middle of that first full paragraph. overt sacrifice troubles the equilibrium of the modern subject, but it becomes completely acceptable in the hidden form that capitalism proffers. In capitalism, subjects can enjoy sacrifice while believing that they aren't. We can enjoy sacrifice in and through its very invisibility when it becomes secular. And so he's kind of continuing that discussion from last chapter of like public and private. He actually says, in a very similar way that capitalism converts things into that, or like sort of jams them into that private space, like sort of colonizes them, like you're saying. It does the same thing to sacrifice. Like it sort of transitions sacrifice from being a public spectacle of like whatever devotion or like commitment to the group, you know, to the public space or something, into something that you can do on your own, and that you should enjoy kind of like in this strange fetishistic almost way, that it's like something that you do and that it gives you this benefit, but it's not to be really mentioned almost, you know, like it's not even necessarily noticed by you that it happens, I guess. You know what I mean? Like,
no, it does actually. I guess I'm curious what Don and Neil think of this too. I guess the thought of that I would have is that, you know, most of the kind of sacrificial, ritualistic sorts of things that I think like capitalism maybe has sort of like rationalized or like secularized and moves into everyday life, I can imagine that most of those rituals had to happen with others, like in some sort of like public common kind of space, perhaps. Not entirely, but I guess that's what I'm wanting to think through, is that like part of why there's this connection point between the two is because to some degree it's like there isn't this like public common space in which you're engaging with others in this like communal kind of social experience of ritual and the transcendent and sacrifice, the more things become secularized.
I think that the trick is, and I don't know if I'm going to get this right, what capitalism is doing, like previous sacrificial sorts of things, when people were kind of using that as a thing to put their destructive drive into, they knew that they were destroying something and that it was going away. Like it was like this food that we could eat, we're going to like leave it out in the middle of the desert or something like that and purposefully not eat it. It will be destroyed and rendered useless. And we're doing that so that we like, you know, that's why there's a destruction in this, right? What's happening in capitalism instead, I think, is that people are still sacrificing things, right? They're kind of like giving them away and just letting them become nothing. But they view it as a productive process, right? They think that there's a production in what they're doing. They don't see it as destructive. What capitalism has done is it's colonized sacrifice, is it has, you know, convinced people and that what their sacrifice isn't a sacrifice, that it's an air quotes investment, right? By doing this, you're investing in something, and because people think they're investing and that they'll get something back, it doesn't have the same sort of quality to it that these older sort of like sacrificial things did. But structurally, it's kind of like the same thing, right? Like the stuff it's just gone. You know, we don't know what happens to it, but it's gone at that point. Does that make sense as I'm saying it, or not so much?
Yeah, I guess in that example, really quick, Neil, I would just sort of wonder, like for you, that example is particularly in the realm of things like economics, finance, like the way that, like the sort of like concrete, like monetary productive part of capitalism works. That's kind of like where you would see that. Like, so basically in some ways you could basically say that the sort of, like the abattoir of like sacrifice that's like very visible in public is the stock market. You know, it's like in many ways, it's like that's kind of a lot of like where people are investing like actual like economic resources and everything else. And, you know, it's like, yeah, maybe you'll get a return on your investment, but maybe it'll just be completely wiped off, like, you know, the face of the servers, like whenever something crashes, or like whenever, you know, a trade doesn't work out, or like, you know, there's a storm that happens on the other side of the world. So I guess I find that interesting, because that I think is very, very clear to me how in the specific realm of the economics and how like the capitalist economy works, that is like absolutely a necessity. Like there has to be sacrifice, but, you know, it has to be framed ideologically as this is you investing in the system.
Yeah. And the other thing that comes from this that I think this is important, right, is that this has to do with this investment kind of thing here. What capitalism is doing is it's actually helping people repress their death drive by making, and maybe I should back up here and say a little bit more about that. So like, we all have a death drive, right? Like, and the death drive is this desire to destroy ourselves. Like we actually want to wreck ourselves and to die. We're all suicidal in a sense. Because to be dead is to not have any desires, to not have any worries, to not have any anxieties, etc. And so it's this, Freud
Bliss,
talked about it.
Peace.
Yeah. It's this, you're not around to have anything, right? You know? And so there's this desire that people have to do that, to render themselves dead, and unbothered by all of the vicissitudes of life. What happens is that drive gets repressed, and there's one of the things that a lot of things happen when it gets repressed. But what capitalism is doing, I think, is repressing the death drive, and because it's repressed, it doesn't mean it goes away. When something is repressed, it's still there, and in fact, still extremely active. It's not destroyed; it's operating, and we see that now in the way that what capitalism has done to the life-sustaining environment that we all need. Right? It is wrecking it. It is destroying it. And that is the death drive kind of asserting itself in a way that is felt by all people, but that is being repressed, and it's being seen as a productive pursuit is kind of what I'm getting at with that.
Yeah, I actually have a quote that I've just been wanting to read this whole time you guys have been talking.
Drop it.
So it's middle of 93, or like the third paragraph down. As subjects, it's about, he's kind of relating these ideas that we're discussing to the Greeks. And so... I'll just read it. As subjects of the signifier, we are no longer just living beings, and this is what ancient Greek society properly understood. The signifier cuts into the living body and implants a little piece of death in us. Our immediate instinctual needs for the presence of objects like food and shelter become desires mediated by the structure of loss. In contrast to the animal, the subject's satisfaction will always depend on the absence of the object it enjoys, even when an object is wholly present, like the BMW one drives. I would never drive a fucking BMW. One's satisfaction depends on what is absent, like the invisible others watching one drive the nice car.
Red Library, sponsored by BMW.
I really loved those BMW Clive Owen commercials. You guys remember those?
Clive Owen is kind of my bae. So,
yeah, it's Clive Owen. BMW big motorized wieners. That was off the dome piece.
Oh, wow. Impressive. Put a little devil on it. Great.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I know which commercials you're talking about with Clive Owen. I don't remember that. I mean, I remember Clive Owen and BMWs, but I don't remember them in conjunction. Maybe
Clive Owen.
He did a car commercial for a while where he was like a driver.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay.
I think it was BMWs, and it was just, using Clive Owen's appeal to make BMWs cool by proxy.
Yeah. Maybe Clive Owen is just purely hyper real. He's just a representation of a signifier that's a representation of something totally lost. Sorry, we just did a Baudrillard episode with Cooper. I'm just real on Baudrillard lately.
Yeah.
Baudrillard's awesome, man.
Yeah,
it's good shit.
Kind of rediscovered my very intense fondness for Baudrillard doing that episode. It was really great, actually.
Nice.
So can we actually unpack the actual BMW quote for a second?
Sure.
So I will say I just found this really interesting, this idea of that one's satisfaction depends on what is absent. So I think for this example of the BMW, it's almost as if it's the recognition of the other that your satisfaction with the car depends on. Would y'all agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
For the that's for the BMW, right? That wouldn't be for all commodities or something?
There he is. Welcome to the show.
wait. What time are we at?
All right. Let's see.
You're on time.
Oh my God, 26 minutes and 33
Okay,
seconds. You're close enough. This is exactly the question I was setting my little trap for Don to ask about. Okay, so fire away.
No, I mean that was the question, right? Is I'm trying to understand this concept, right? Is it obviously for the BMW, it's like a status symbol, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the implication is that you would want other people to see you driving it. Can you guys give me some other examples of when satisfaction depends on what is absent?
I've got a perfect example of this.
Okay,
well,
yeah.
I mean, it's kind of long-winded, but I'll say it anyway. Because whatever,
Sure.
what is time? And so
Flat circle.
That's my man right there. Commissar Neil, that's my man.
Yeah. So old McConaughey.
Job.
Time is a flat circle.
Why should I live in history, huh? Doc, I don't want to know anything anymore. This is a world where nothing is solved. When someone once told me time is a flat circle. Everything we've ever done or will do, we're gonna do over and over and over again.
And so, I was doing the like rolling the booger in my fingers. Okay, so you get stranded on a desert island. No, on an island in the ocean. Okay, and you just happen upon, after like days of like trying to collect food and like building yourself a shelter, you happen upon somebody else that was stranded on the island, and it happens to be like a beautiful woman that is also doing the same thing. So you go and you meet up, and then you fall in love, and it turns out being stranded on an island isn't even that bad, because here's this woman that you fell in love with, and so you bang out, and then afterwards, right, you gotta get her. This is the way I'm telling this story is completely ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. But like basically, after, right, you feel this deep sense of like dissatisfaction, right, and so you go in the forest, you collect a few things, some like leaves. You kind of make like clothing out of leaves, and like you collect some coconut fibers and make like a nice like wig. And you go to your newfound lover in this island, and you say, hey, like, I'm gonna ask you to do something, but you're gonna think it's really weird, right? And you just like hand her all of this shit that you made, and you say, can you like go put all this on, and then go hide and put it all on, and then come back out. Right, and then like when she comes back out dressed up as like your best friend, then you like proceed to tell her about how it was so great. You like fell in love in the island, and you got to bang this like beautiful woman, and it was like the perfect majestic moment, right? Like it wouldn't matter at all if that situation had happened to you if there was no one for you to tell it to, or no one to know that it happened. It wouldn't be satisfying in the way that the fantasy implies it would be satisfying. You would have to have somebody else. I know. I sound like a complete maniac right now.
McGowan told the story on one of his podcasts, actually.
Did he? Maybe that's why I remember it.
I think it was Olivia Munn might have been the person who they used, right? It's like you tell Olivia Munn to draw a mustache on herself and to meet you on the other side of the island, and you tell her about your experience with Olivia Munn. Yeah. That was the story they gave. There's a different version of this, which is... there's this like preacher who's every day, like, every week he does this thing, and he really, really kind of like tells people that they're really bad people, like they're really sinful and awful and wretched, and if they don't like give a lot of money to the collection for the church to help the needy and stuff like that. And he goes on to talk about how like he gives so much, and he's not asking anybody to do anything that he wouldn't do, and all this stuff, right? And it's effective. Like people keep on giving lots of money to this thing. And then what happens is the next day after the service, he drives all the way to like 6 towns over, and he plays golf at this extremely expensive golf course, right? Like, because it's all a ruse. Like he's not actually giving any money to the church. He's just telling people he's doing that, and no one would know, right? And so he's doing this other stuff with all the money that they're giving him. He's buying this expensive golf course membership. So an angel checks this out one day. He's like, oh man, that's not cool. So an angel goes and tells God, and God's like, I got this. And what God does is he has the guy drive to the golf course, and he does his golf game, and he golfs a perfect game. Every single hole, he hits the ball, and it goes directly into the hole that it should go into right away, right? And the guy's so excited because like no one has ever done this in the history of golf, right? And the angel is baffled and says to God, like, God, what are you doing, man? Like, you just hooked up dude. And God's like, who's he going to tell about it?
Yeah. He can't tell
anyone. So the idea is he can't be satisfied with this accomplishment because there's nobody to share it with, right? Like if he shares it with people, he's going to be busted. And so he can't share it with people. It robs him of the enjoyment of what he gets. There's something lacking, which is the ability to share the experience.
Don?
So, I mean, like in all these examples, it's specifically about the ability to tell others about something, like about the object that you enjoyed or something, or the experience that you enjoyed, right?
Oh, well, it's just
yes.
Yeah, but it's just to elucidate the structure of
right. But that's not like, I guess I'm just trying to understand, like, because that's his example here too, right? Is enjoying the BMW requires the invisible others watching you drive. I just wasn't sure if, like in this example, it seems clear that the BMW, because it's a status symbol, like would require like kind of what you want is that other people see. Is there like other ways or like other, I guess, relationships in which case, there's the, the absence, it depends on the absence of the object that you enjoy.
So stop me if I've done this one before. Have I talked to you guys about the episode of The Twilight Zone?
Yeah, we have talked about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Same thing there, right? Where the guy, like, he thinks he's in heaven because he keeps on getting all the things he wants.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But then, eventually he's just like, I never get an opportunity to want anything, right? Like every time, like before I even realize that I want something, it's like there in front of me. And so this is terrible. Like this is actually awful because there is no lack. There is no, I don't have it. And without that, I don't have it. Having everything is actually not that interesting. It's kind of boring. It's the lack, the not having, which is sort of the necessary component for any sort of enjoyment.
I could also see in this particular example that we could, I think, distinguish between two sort of almost separate ways to think through this. I mean, one, I think, would be the idea that it is precisely through the lack of something that we experience enjoyment. And if we had everything we wanted, like that actually wouldn't be enjoyable. Like that's actually kind of our nightmare, is to actually have everything that you would want. And I could also see in this example the fact that what is absent is the recognition of the other, that's also like a really crucial element, right? That there is an element of part of what we even enjoy in the first place, or Neil, you might have to step in on this one, because I don't know if I want to say like what we desire or what we like, or what we feel is demanded of us or demanded that we should desire or should enjoy is sort of based upon the recognition of the other. And so I could see how we could talk about this as like a general structure of how desire functions and the necessity of lack to actually like feel any kind of satisfaction, and how that functions as a sort of distinct thing, or at least a different way to look at this versus like our satisfaction depends on the recognition of the other. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just like mulling over a possible example of it. It's not so much even about the desire necessarily, but just on the level of the signifier and just language and how it functions in general, right? Like the reason that we have to have a signifier is because of the object's absence, or because of its inability to signify itself, right? And so you can't even have just even the most basic like expression, like form of expression, without there being some absence that necessitates your calling out of the thing itself, And so in that sense, you could think like there's a necessity to represent that which is lost, but that necessity doesn't appear as like some kind of necessity. It appears as like your voluntary expression of what it is that you observe. But in a sense, without your expression, it's like the absent thing necessitates you, as opposed to you freely engaging in expression and expressing the thing. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like, because that thing is absent, it's necessitating your existence, as opposed to it being there and you just freely interacting with it. Maybe this is more confusing than
whatever you said. Does that make sense?
Okay. It's just the way Don looked at me. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Are you guys how many of you guys are a fan of like the 36 chambers?
Don's out.
Hit the button on the table and he just falls away.
This is the ejector seat.
If you're not a fan of that album, man, every time you ask a question that I don't like, I'm just going to pretend that you asked a question that I did, and I'm going to answer that question. So you're going to be asking questions like, what is the other? And I'm going to just be like, oh, it's really interesting that you asked, Don. I really do like The Punisher. And it's just like...
I mean, I don't like music, so like it doesn't really matter what album it is. I just
Oh shit! We just opened up a new can of worms here.
That is amazing. Like, if you don't have a Tinder profile, you need to make one right now. And
just say that.
I don't like music.
I don't like music.
I don't like music. Else. Yeah, that's it.
Don't even need a picture of yourself. Just I don't like music.
Oh, that would be so great.
You should just have like a sunset for your profile picture, and it just says I don't like music. Yeah.
No, I think that would like break the algorithm, right? Like no one ever messages dudes on Tinder, but like you will get more messages.
That would be the most Chad thing imaginable.
Well, the original thing I was going to try to say here is that when Wu-Tang did that first album, like no one knew who these, like, I mean, some people did, like kind of, right? But I mean, they weren't, the Wu-Tang Clan was not known like outside of New York. And they were hustling to get this recognition. That's what they craved was for people to like know them and to be impressed by them and to want to buy their stuff and to so on and so on. So they get that. And the weird thing is then, like now that they've gotten that recognition, that's not enough. They want even more recognition, right? But it gets to a point where you actually can't get any more recognition from the other, whatever form the other takes, more people, another actual specific person, what have you. But that's the thing that people keep on reaching for is for more people, more societies, more people to be impressed by them, I suppose, right? Like that, if you want to say recognition of the other, you can perhaps equate it to being impressive to more and more people over time. And the people always want more of that.
I think there also is a way too that whenever we think about like something that is absent, you know, this is maybe a very different kind of example, but I think about the question of like, where do the things that we desire, like where do those begin? Like where is the boundary between what we desire and think that is like worthy of our time and attention and spending our efforts on versus what it is that sort of is mediated by like something outside of us, like the symbolic or sort of like social institutions and culture, anything like that. I mean, whenever we first started talking about this, I mean, you know, just to keep it real 100 on the show, I mean, one of the things I thought about was like, well, I mean, how about like your career or like the kind of person you think is deemed worthy of being a suitable romantic partner in this society? You know, I mean, like these things, this is actually one of the interesting sort of, I think, like critiques around like sexual preferences and race and like gender and like how those things are actually mediated by the symbolic outside of you. It's like, how do I know that what I find attractive is some spontaneous like desire that's emerging from me or something that has actually been mediated by representations of race and gender and what beauty is from outside of me? I mean, the point is like, that's the whole point, is to like understand that they're like, in some sense, like your desires are never fully your own. Like they're always mediated by, you know, however you want to say it, like ideology, culture, the symbolic, whatever. But that's, I mean, that to me is what I think about. It's like, so even whenever I think about, I desire this person, there's some element to which the thing that is absent is like the recognition of people and like the social world around me that says, yes, you are desiring the thing that you should be desiring, and therefore you are like a valuable, worthy, successful member of society. So, I mean, it's a very different kind of example, but to me, that always is a very personal one that I think is something that, you know, a lot of us can understand, because the level of like, you know, like sex and like sexual desire is like a, you know, is a universal one. Right. And so to me, that's kind of one of the ways I think about like how what is absent in that desire is usually that recognition and that sort of validation or sort of like how that desire gets sort of like generated or structured for me in the first place.
If I could interject something, maybe, Don, rather than trying to satisfy your understanding here, maybe I could propose a possibility of like something maybe you want to defend about the structure of desire, maybe like as opposed to seeing the BMW as something that you get because you like want others to see you, like what would be your perspective as like an alternative?
I mean, just to be clear, like there are times in this book when I'm arguing against something, right? And there are times
I know it's not about you. I just
when I just like don't when I read that, I'm more just like I'm not sure how to think through that. Like, okay, gotcha. So
I wasn't sure if you were like, well, I would just get a BMW because I would do this, or like I would.
I mean, I will say I feel like that there are times in which I have like enjoyed things for myself and have enjoyed them without like needing to tell other people about them. But, you know, like, I think that this is like an interesting, I feel like it's probably like a very key point to Lacan, or this, like, probably this entire book. And I guess I'm just trying to like, basically just understand like how to think through like basically all desires being dependent upon the absence of what it enjoys.
Okay. So maybe like, even though you enjoyed the thing without telling anyone about it, there is, I mean, I think that the structure that's being proposed here is basically that there is an anonymous or like overarching other that still is at the heart of the enjoyment that you experience yourself. And so despite you not going, yeah, like a panopticon.
Panopticon to I know, but Don likes Foucault, so I'm tossing that in there.
Maybe, I don't know. He's okay.
Whoa.
He's all right.
Put the Foucault down. Oh, no.
Listen, Don doesn't like music. He doesn't like Foucault. He doesn't like McGowan.
Damn.
I didn't say those things. I mean, I did say the music.
I didn't deny them.
I don't like music. But.
You know what's really funny about this, Don? Like, there's a kind of like this very strong suggestion in psychoanalysis, and it's never give the hysteric what they desire or what they demand, actually.
Yeah.
And like sometimes when we're having these conversations, I'm thinking to myself, like, no, don't answer Don's question. Don't give the hysteric what he demands. Don't do it. Because what you're doing is actually really interesting. If you're actually mulling these things over, that means you're thinking about it and you're making some attempt to work it out, you know, and that's actually the point, right? Is to not to have the answer, but to be kind of like trying to find it. If you found what you thought was the answer, it would be the answer only for like a little bit, then you'd be bored with it and you'd need a new answer. So, you know, what McGowan is actually doing perhaps is extremely effective at mobilizing your desire in some way, and we should all say good job, McGowan.
Holla McGowan.
Okay, so does that mean you guys aren't going to answer my questions then?
No. Here, I have an example from McGowan. Here's from McGowan. Let's talk about this one.
Call in Zaddy for backup.
Call in Zaddy. Please, Zaddy, come help me. So here we go. Let's see.
Oh, you guys are saying this. You know what's comes to mind. This is a really stupid association, and I'm sorry. Alex is about to say something important.
No, you're good.
Keep your place,
important.
Alex.
It's
Say the
just some
stupid.
scatological nonsense.
I have a young child, and I have friends who also have young children. And there's this thing that happens, like when like a young child is sort of in they're using the toilet, right? But they still need a little bit of help, you know, and stuff like that. So I can't tell you how many times I've heard, "Dad, come wipe me." From I have done my part now, Dad. It's always Dad. Always Dad.
Yeah.
Dad, come wipe me. And so that's what I was just thinking of when you made the, you know.
Damn.
Well,
I'm going to hear that in my nightmares, Neil. Thank you. Thank you for telling me
and
that.
actually, what I don't think that's a stupid association to bring up, because theoretically, we have just basically said we've wiped as much as we could. Now call in Daddy to help answer Don's question.
Okay, I'm just going to read it directly. It's at the bottom of 93. It's that last paragraph. We can see this at work in the satisfaction of basic needs. The speaking subject does not have sex with just another flesh and blood object, but also with the fantasy of an object that isn't there. Every actual partner substitutes for the lost object in the sex act. The subject of the signifier gets off on what isn't there, not on what is, even when actually having sex rather than surfing the internet for porn. And this is equally the case with eating. Talks about perfect slice of pizza. But if that...
No, actually, I would say that's the interesting part that I'd want to talk about, is the next sentence, right?
Which is the slice of pizza?
Yeah.
Okay,
it's like,
shit.
while eating the perfect slice of pizza, right, I ponder the piece of cake that I've had for dessert. And when I'm eating the bite of cake, I anticipate the next one, right? This is at the very, very bottom of 93.
I don't know. That's why I didn't really go on, because I felt like that subverted the point that McGowan was trying to make about sex, and how, like, when you fantasize, you know, beyond your partner in the sexual act, like, that in a sense is a good example of a way that we can all relate to fantasy and the absence of the thing that you desire. You know, that it's like, it's the fantasy that really motivates you to have the sex. I don't know about thinking about cake when I'm eating pizza. Like,
I mean, I didn't. There was part of me that was like, I mean, when I have really good food, I feel like what makes it really good is it's essentially the fact that it like makes me forget everything else. Like, I don't think about what's next, or what I have eaten. It's just like, you know, purely in the moment or something. So.
Yeah. Well, okay, but so maybe, you know, once again relating back to sex, like, sex is sort of a nihilistic fantasy, right? Because, like, in the moment of orgasm, what you accomplish is specifically forgetting everything that exists for, like, just a brief moment, right? Like, it's almost like kind of what Neil was talking about with death before, of, like, it being this, like, sort of relief from all of the vicissitudes of life. You know, sex gives you, like, a momentary relief. And so eating, maybe for you, takes on that same quality of like when you're eating, you can just kind of forget everything else that's going on and just enjoy the food directly. But once again, the structure of that fantasy still exists, right? That the thing that makes you think that the food is good and gives you that sense of like forgetting is still motivated by something beyond the food itself, right? Like, or else you could just eat corn cakes every fucking day and never eat anything else and still experience that like wow of like, this just makes me forget everything and I enjoy it. You know what I'm saying?
That's a good way to put it, though. What Alex is getting at, even when people eat health food, they tend to be getting off on the approval of some internalized other that's patting them on the back and telling them they're doing a good thing.
Right.
It's this like, don't feel guilty, feel good about how you eat. Likewise, if people eat cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they're getting off on the fact that they're getting away with it. But there's another that's being like, hey, you shouldn't do that, and they're doing it anyways. So in both cases, it cuts two ways. It's not like a one-way thing. You're either enjoying yourself because you're getting the approval of the other, or you're enjoying yourself because you're being admonished by the other and you're getting away with it. That's kind of what perversion is in Lacan's world, right? It's the ability to break the rules and to, in a sense, in some way, get away with it, ultimately. But this is always predicated on the presence of there being some greater authority that either approves of or tells you should feel bad about what you're doing.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like I've had both of those experiences to where like, yeah, there's like an enjoyment from, like eating like the healthy food or something like that. And also the enjoyment from like eating something that's particularly unhealthy.
The booty.
Is that unhealthy?
No, I don't know. I mean, maybe physically, like, like if I get you sick, but no, I think it's very healthy.
But like, I mean, when I think of like my favorite meals that I've had.
I love Neil's reaction to some of these comments. It's really just beautiful. Just mwah.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, no.
Real horny on Main tonight on Red Library.
Isn't this what this is what we're always doing? We always talk about sex and butts and shit, I
want Don to be a stand-up comedian. I'd pay good money to go to that.
But but like for the best foods that I've had, right? It's like the health aspect of it was like completely like absent, I guess. Like I didn't really, to me, I wouldn't even know if they would be considered healthy or unhealthy, because it would be like, I don't know, some like Thai dish or something like that, that I ate that I'm like, I actually don't really know if it's healthy or unhealthy. I just know that I really like it. And so it's like, I definitely have had the experience of both the things you talk about. I just don't know if it would, like when I'm eating the perfect slice of pizza, I mean, for me, I wouldn't use pizza, but I'd use some other meal. But it's like when I'm eating the perfect meal, it doesn't seem, at least subjectively, like those things are actually playing into it.
I mean, so go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, isn't it that we could take it out of food, right? Like, if you ever were in school and you should have been doing something for school, and instead of doing that thing for school, you decided to read something that was more interesting to you. Mm-hmm. Same thing there, right? Like you can have the other validating you for doing your schoolwork and like being like, good job, you did the thing you're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. Or you can be not doing your schoolwork, but like ultimately, like there's nobody with a gun in the other room who's going to come in here and start like shooting you for, you're getting away with it. But it's all contingent on this other. So this is kind of taking it out of food.
Okay.
Well, and also one thing I was going to say, just to kind of maybe relate it back to the text a little bit, I think what McGowan is arguing is specifically that aspect of sacrifice is what capitalism aims to like abscond as fully and as seamlessly as it can. So I'm not calling you a capitalist or anything, Don, but I'm just saying maybe that it's effective, like that there are degrees to which this like the basis of sacrifice that sort of grounds our investiture in capital is something that has been successfully absconded from you, and that it's not something that you generally imagine happening when you engage in your like daily activities. But like I think McGowan is both arguing that there is an element of loss and sacrifice in it, and he uses the examples of like labor, and how, our time is sacrificed and how like our wealth is sacrificed to purchase commodities and things like that. But I think the whole thing that he's trying to bring to light is like specifically the way that we don't conceive of any of this stuff as sacrifice inherently in like our day-to-day experience of capitalism. We experience it as us like just freely doing the things that we do because we like them or because they give us some satisfaction in some way. And he's trying to argue like, yes, but it's like a destructive satisfaction or like a satisfaction that's like actually a satisfaction in your own losing of something that you've given up, So,
do y'all mind if I bring us back to the text since you brought up like labor and that sort of thing? So it's a pretty like full size paragraph, but it's on the bottom of 95. I feel like it's a good connection point to make. So McGowan says the noxiousness of profit for Marx resides in its obfuscation of the worker's sacrifice that creates the value of the commodity. The capitalist profits from a sacrifice and then hides this sacrifice. As Marx sees it, workers exchange their labor time for a wage, and this exchange does not involve exploitation. But exploitation enters into the relationship through the worker's production of surplus value, the result of the excessive productivity of labor. If the exchange were just an even exchange, labor time for the production of the commodity, so that would be the even exchange, the capitalist would be left with no way to profit from it because no value would have been created. Value requires the act of sacrifice, and this is what occurs when labor produces surplus value. During the production of surplus value, workers sacrifice themselves for the profit of the capitalist. Marx's revolutionary idea is that workers should enjoy the value that their sacrifice creates. So I actually thought that was a pretty just brilliant connection between like the basic Marxist like approach of like the labor theory of value as it would relate to sacrifice in capitalism.
There's another great line. It's on the next page here in 96 where McGowan says, the worker sacrifices time for money and no amount of money can ever create time. Very good. It gets at this, right? That succinctly, it's like, bam, mic drop. But that is what's happening here. There is this enormous amount sacrificing our time so that we can work. And a lot of times it's not even like how much time do you spend at red lights driving to work under normal circumstances, right? Like that time is sacrificed so that you can create surplus value.
And what I really like about that connection too, Neil, is that it really harkens back to what you said about sacrifice means that we destroy something we can never get back. I mean, that's sort of the ultimate tragedy of this sort of intensity of sacrifice under capital is that the time you spend, the destruction on your body and your mind and your mental health, like the time away from your family or your friends or everything else, these are things that you will never get back. I mean, I think this is still why at the end of the day, like the very first labor movement, its whole focus was the length of the working day. We've said this on past episodes. I still think that this is something that like is really crucial to understand. It's like part of the reason why labor movements and radical labor politics emerged in this particular way was precisely because they understood that the more of our time and bodies and minds we sacrifice, like we will never get that back. And so the struggle has to be over time itself. Because I think in another way you could think about it, it's also about how much of me and my life am I going to sacrifice for you to have profit. I mean, I think it's also a way of trying to wrestle that back as well.
Yeah, he gets into that shortly too about the fetishistic disavowal that occurs in this process as well, which is something I know that Alex brought up a little bit ago.
Yeah. I was actually going to read a quote. It's on 97, just since we're kind of powering through this little section because it's just sort of reinforcing what we brought up in the first section of the chapter. It's like middle of 97 at the end of that second full paragraph. It says, we must be able not to know that the production of the commodity required sacrifice. The labor embodied in the commodity must remain hidden, though we must also maintain an unconscious awareness of it. And then he kind of goes on to say after that, in that next paragraph toward the end, in other words, fetishists don't know that they know and work to ensure that they will never know this. The disavowal permits knowledge and ignorance to coexist, and this coexistence is vital for the modern subject. So he's kind of arguing that because of, like fetishistic disavowal, like what you're saying, Neil, it's because of that we're able to both know the unconscious, like sort of destructive potential of our engagement in capital, but simultaneously continue to operate in ignorance of what we know. And like, it doesn't seem to create like a cognitive dissonance, which is like one of those things that psychologists like to say a lot, right? Like, cognitive dissonance, doesn't this cause a cognitive dissonance? But it's like, actually, nah, like in our culture, cognitive dissonance is the norm. Like, that's like the standard for how we operate. So, and I'm not saying that, there is never cognitive dissonance, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
There was I think it was a College Humor sketch that I saw, and this was maybe 2 years ago, but it is such a beautiful, sly kind of way of grappling with this necessity of not knowing and knowing at the same time. So the scene is, I'll see if I can paste in a clip of it if I can find it, but the scene is, it's like a Saturday afternoon, it's beautiful out, it's like 3 or 4 friends sitting around in a front room, and they're like, oh, like, what should we do today? And then someone basically says, oh, like, well, we could like go to this restaurant. And then someone says, oh, well, yeah, but just keep in mind that, all their ingredients aren't free range and, organic and free trade. And and then they basically proceed to go through every possible activity, and someone is making them conscious of the destructive, sacrificial nature of like workers, of the environment, of like, people being exploited all over the world to like enjoy all these things that you normally would enjoy, like with this disavowal operating. Yeah. But there's this great moment whenever one of the friends basically like pulls out a gun and he says, oh, well, like, why don't I just shoot myself in the head? Because there's no way to enjoy anything. And then they proceed to basically tell the friend that if he shoots himself in the head, all the evil exploitative things he's participating in by shooting himself in the head, and then they even deny him the escape of death from the knowledge itself. And it is just one of those things, I'm like, I don't know if they read McGowan, but it is like a perfect representation of like the trauma and the sort of like nightmare of what would happen if you had to live with the full awareness, conscious awareness of the sort of sacrificial, destructive nature of everything that you're doing every day.
Mm-hmm. That's a good example, I think, of the real.
Yeah,
in a sense, right? So, like, I mean, the real is just how contingent we are, how fragile we are, how limited our lives are, and whatnot. We don't usually walk around with that kind of like front of mind, because to do so would, if we actually did that, right? Like, I think, and really weren't really actually were confronted and integrated into our subjectivity, just how much our destructiveness is involved in our comfort. That would kind of really do something terrible to us. And as a result, the fetishistic disavowal occurs and allows for us to continue to do the things that make us comfortable, and at the same time continue to believe that we're good people. Right. And that's what I think McGowan is getting at. Capitalism's great trick is that it does cover over the exploitation, the slavery, the death and destruction, the just complete undoing of the environment. And we can still think like we're good people as we do this, right? Because we're keeping the economy going, and we're being good workers and seeing to the needs of our families and all these other things that come along with it.
This is only half in jest, but I feel like the closest thing I could imagine of what kind of subject you would be if you lived with the like full knowledge of death and like all of that all the time. I feel like you'd just be a straight up doomer. Like, that's what being a doomer is to me, is like you're just somehow like constantly grappling with the real as best as you can. Like, it's just everything is meaningless. It's almost like
nothing means nothing.
I don't know if that's also a relationship to like what nihilism
the Joker.
Is. It's so funny you said that, because part of what I wanted to say is like, yeah, it'd just be like Doomer mask off, Joker rise up style. That was immediately what I thought as soon as you said that, Neil. But I didn't say it until now.
I'm trying to find the quote. I don't know where it actually comes from, but there's like that famous Marx quote where he's like, they don't know, but they are doing it. When he's talking about like
ideology,
ideology, participation in capital, that he's kind of saying the workers, specifically this kind of notion that like they continue to do it and they disavow their knowledge of what it is they're participating in, despite them like having lost a finger in the factory, right? And not being able to play tennis with that nice racket they bought or whatever, or like, I don't know, that's a stupid example, but like, that even though it's immediately in front of their faces, they disavow the way that they had to sacrifice in order to be able to participate in capital.
So this might be a bit of a tangent. I am curious here. If we think about this sort of necessity of like knowledge and sort of like unconscious awareness and how that's sort of like the norm in capitalism. And since you brought up that quote, I was wondering about if Zizek's formulation of pure ideology would sort of like how that would change how we're thinking about this, because Zizek's formulation is obviously to flip it around and say you do it even though you know it. And so is there a way that would give us, like, would that force us to think about this differently? Like, is there a way that we can also recognize, oh yes, I know that if I buy this iPhone, like that there are, kids in coltan mines in like the Congo who are just brutally like pressed into slave labor, but I know that, and yet I'm still going to persist in doing it. Is that, I don't know, I'm wondering how to think through Zizek's formulation of that in relation to what McGowan's talking about. Again, that might be a huge tangent to go down, but
I mean, I think
that Zizek is perverse.
No doubt there. Is he perverse?
Maybe I should say a little bit more about that. Like, I mean, perversion is when it isn't, I mean, usually people hear that word, they think it's like about a sexual thing. And the way I'm using it, it could be that, but it's not necessarily that. So like there's a difference between like being ignorant of something and like doing something without the knowledge of what you're doing. So I'll give you an example of this, right? Like there was this thing that was on NPR a number of years ago where there was a story about a zoo doing live feeding of the big like cat animals, right?
Oh my God.
This is just audio, but it's this kid who's saying like, why is the cat eating the goat? And somebody's like explaining to the kid like, well, that's what tigers eat. And the kid says something like, well, I wouldn't do that. Like, I would not eat an animal. The adult's like, well, actually you do eat animals. Like whenever you eat a hamburger, that's actually a cow.
God, just fuck that kid's whole life up.
Then the kid's very upset by this. He's like, wait, you're making that up. They're just messing with me. And the guy, no, really, that's what it is. And the kid's like, wait, what? I'm eating what? And like, because that kid was ignorant, right? Like that's the thing here. So now it's like, imagine several years in the future, that kid like is, just eating this like really rare hamburger and being like, oh yeah, this is this. And he's like putting it in people's faces. Like he goes to like a vegetarian event and just like eats this juicy burger or something like that. And it's just like showing off how much they're enjoying the burger. Like that's a perverse enjoyment of that thing, right? Now that perverse enjoyment of that thing could be, tied to the initial kind of like trauma of realizing it, and that's just like one way that you can deal with it. So I don't know if that makes perversion make any more sense to anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't arguing that Zizek wasn't perverse. I mean, he like made the movies like Pervert's Guide to Cinema and Pervert's Guide to Ideology.
Pervert,
He's
yeah,
definitely like I don't know, but yeah, that's a good elucidation of kind of like the concept itself, because I guess maybe people don't really know what that refers to. But.
So really quick, just a little chime in here. We're at about an hour. Okay. So just in terms of time, or I mean, Alex, this is your show, man. So
yeah,
it's kind of like
you brought. Well, I mean, you brought up the Congo, right? Like the coltan mines and stuff, and I think the next section just addresses that directly, and I think it's one of the more substantive sections in this chapter. I've got a couple of quotes out of it, but I kind of figured we could just sort of, because it's like a lot of different examples of like how, like just examples of the kind of knowledge that we disavow in our participation in capitalism, and like what how those things can kind of elucidate this phenomena of simultaneously sustaining knowledge and ignorance, and that they kind of have this strange like spectral boundary between them. So yeah, I mean, the obvious example, right, is like the one you brought up, Adam, of like children in mines, trying to gather, precious metal type resources that they use in the circuitry of our like cell phones, and the sort of implications that this has, and sort of how you could like follow somebody around throughout their whole life and like sort of terrorize them with like all of this kind of knowledge of like, yeah, everything that you do sort of like somehow implicates like the lives of other people, or somebody being maimed in a textile factory somewhere, or like, Foxconn, these types of places where they have like nets so people don't kill themselves because the work is so demanding, stuff like that. So, I mean, my perspective on this is that it's almost over talked about nowadays. Like we hear about it more than ever. And so in a sense, what you were talking about before with like what Zizek might say about this, my perspective would kind of be like my example that I like using, which I think, and maybe it is from Zizek, but like he talks about cigarettes, right? And how there was a study done where they polled people that smoked cigarettes and people that didn't smoke cigarettes, and they asked them how dangerous they thought cigarettes were for their health, and that in general, the people that completed the survey overestimated how dangerous cigarettes were for their own health, that they, in their own minds, thought cigarettes were worse for them than they actually are in real life. And yet, you know, people still smoke, like a lot of those people still were smokers. And so it's kind of like it goes to that point of like, there is a degree to which you can know very well, but, right, like that sort of Zizek'ian formulation of like a reversal of the fetishistic disavowal, right? And like more of like an explicit understanding. And I mean, I feel like you'd be hard pressed nowadays to encounter someone who just was like in a totally naive state about the things that they participate in capitalism. There's so many like organic alternatives to like, you know, big factory farm type, products from the stores. Like you can get sustainably derived paper products. You can get, you know, like, you know, it's kind of like that whole phenomenon of like coffee without caffeine, like the decaf coffee, right? You can get the thing that you want that you know is bad, but you can get it deprived of its subversive quality, right, in some way or another. And I mean, I don't think that there's a sustainable, like ethical cell phone company yet, but maybe there is. It probably would cost a fortune. But that's another thing, right? In order to attain that feeling of like you participating in the world in an ethical and sustainable, cognizant kind of way, like where you have like this consciousness of all these things that happen that are bad, you have to pay exorbitantly more. I mean, like think about like Tesla or something, and like why people want to drive around in a Tesla or like a Toyota Prius or whatever, all these like new electric cars that they've made. Like, why is it that you will pay such a premium to be able to drive around in a car that you feel like doesn't use oil or doesn't use gasoline? And it's like, well, those things cause war, and they cause sort of like all of this intervention in other countries. They cause violence, and, you know, it's like this imperialist empire we live in. I don't want to participate in that. So I sacrifice, you know, in order to be able to say that I'm not tacitly endorsing those things. But it's like the ultimate fucking fantasy, right? Like, of course you're endorsing it. Like, even by, you know, offering you the option, capitalism has just like exploited your ability to understand that there are subversive things that happen to get you some like nice hamburger on your table or like some nice car in your garage, right? Like, you're still participating in capitalism, knows this, so they exploit you even further by saying, well, if you don't want to feel bad, but you still want the thing, we'll make it for you without all that bad stuff. You just pay a little more, you know?
Well, we actually talked about this, me and Comrade Jared, shout out, on the David Harvey episode about why there is no ethical consumption under capitalism.
Right.
I guess the connection point to McGowan that's interesting is that, you know, we can, I think, discuss about how basically capitalism will sell you back a more ethical, quote unquote, form of your consumption, charge you double the price, and yet really just still obscure all the really horrible shit that goes into that. For anyone that doesn't know, if you go to Whole Foods because you think that that's going to like save you from like this sort of like sacrificial destruction, like Whole Foods also uses like basically non-labored, like non-contracted, like undocumented labor, and they exploit the shit out of them, and it's brutal. Like they do it just as much as everyone else, but
same business model as Walmart. They just have a different appearance.
It's what is it called? Like quote unquote conscious capitalism.
Yeah.
Which the CEO of Whole Foods wrote a book called Conscious Capitalism, and everyone was reading it as if like this was going to be the thing that saves the world, right? But well, it saves capitalism and maybe keeps it running for a little bit longer. But the connection that normally isn't made is that the extra amount of money you'll spend on the Prius or the organic food has this sacrificial element. It's that I'm sacrificing, you know, that resource of mine to basically have that sort of almost like sacred, I mean, it is. I think it's a very like almost sort of like superstitious, almost like quasi like religious kind of thing that you're doing. It's like it's like paying for indulgences. It's like I'll pay you double the amount for these blueberries and I know that I get to feel a certain way about myself and think about myself as an ethical consumer of a certain kind, and I'm also like getting the enjoyment of sacrificing to be that. And so I think it's an interesting layer to put on this typical critique about like ethical consumption and how it actually is just reinforcing everything that we're critiquing here.
Mm-hmm. What's up, Neil? Go ahead.
What's up, Neil?
There's an important thing with that. to
Sorry, I don't know why I said it like that.
yeah, I think this guy's going to talk again.
What's up? What's up, man? What's up?
What you're doing there is important, and this actually, to keep it in the text here, page 110 brings this up. This is where McGowan brings in Bataille, right?
Oh, hell yeah.
Oh yeah.
And this is an important thing here, because what he's pointing out here is, and this is brilliant, I think, right? Like, this is kind of down in the first paragraph under the subtitle, "The Hidden Enjoyment and Its Vicissitudes." Bataille locates satisfaction not in. Okay.
I'm just like laughing because I just realized what I wrote in my notes for this whole section. It just says, "Don't terrorism, guys. K, thanks, bye." That's what it says.
And we're done. We're done with the chapter on sacrifice. No terrorism, y'all. Peace.
And bad. But anyway, go ahead, Neil. I'm sorry to
That's a good note. I dig it. But Bataille locates satisfaction not in accumulation of goods, but in their sacrifice. Since sacrifice functions as our basic mode of satisfying ourselves, capitalism represents an ontological retreat and abandonment of our mode of enjoyment. That's solid, right? Like, what he's getting at here is that we actually don't get the enjoyment from having the Tesla or whatever object you want to acquire by buying it. We get the enjoyment because we pay to get the Tesla, because we have to sacrifice our time. Well, we had to sacrifice the money, but we had to get the money. We had to sacrifice their time to get this thing, right? And the enjoyment is actually not in the having; it's in the giving. It's in sacrificing.
In the sacrifice,
in getting rid of our time, getting rid of our life, getting rid of our money. Like, that's what we enjoy. And I mean, I think we can. I can talk to people who are very supportive of capitalism. And one of the things that this is a point we can agree on. People really enjoy buying stuff. They really enjoy the sacrifice, is what I think, that goes into the buying. A capitalist might not see it as a sacrifice, but that's according to this, and this is what I believe, that's what it is, right? It's a sacrifice that's occurring, and that's where the enjoyment is derived.
So I want to pick up on this, because I will say this is the first time that we've discussed Bataille on the show, I think, or mentioned Bataille specifically, and I'm really glad this is the way it's coming about, because we have actually all read...
shit on him.
Huh?
So we can ruthlessly shit on him?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I want to ruthlessly shit on Bataille, but I mean, McGowan has an interesting critique that I want to discuss. But I will say that we've read... what is the name of the book that we read with John? I'm not going to put this in the show, but...
Theory of Religion? The Eye. The Story of the Eye.
Sorry, I'm talking about the most fucked up, like, sexually explicit novel I've ever read, and something about religion.
Theory of Religion?
No, it's the one about sacrifice in the economy.
Oh.
Shit. Anyway, all right, but there's a Bataille book. It's I think 2 volumes, and it is essentially where his theory of sacrifice and enjoyment and excess come from. So we've actually read a bit of it together, and it's really interesting. So what McGowan says that I think is really, I find really intriguing. I'm curious what y'all think about this. So I'm going to read this paragraph to lay it all out. But he says, the problem with Bataille, however, is that his theory of sacrifice is grounded in an ontology of excess energy. We enjoy sacrifice because we are burdened with too much energy. There is enjoyment in the diminution of this burden, but Bataille never explains how this excess arises and how we obtain it. In this way, he misses the creative power of sacrifice, its capacity to form something out of nothing. We don't begin with too much, but with undifferentiated being, and sacrifice enables us to differentiate, to create a value where none otherwise existed. It is the creative power of sacrifice that generates its appeal. So I was curious what you all make of that criticism, that Bataille is starting with this idea that there is this inherent excess already. And it's this creative appeal that sacrifice allows us to almost like differentiate things out of an undifferentiated sort of being, as he says. So I'm just going to lay that out there. Sacrifice differentiates, undifferentiated being, has this creative appeal. That's actually what we enjoy about it. Go.
That makes me think of Freud in a lot of ways, right? So Freud talks about the death drive, and what I think he's getting at in Beyond the Pleasure Principle is he uses the word, depending on the translation you're reading, excitation, tension. People have this excitation, this nervous energy, and they need to do something with it. And now some of it can be put into various things that you need to do just to kind of like keep yourself going, like going to work and doing your laundry, whatever. But there's always going to be a surplus sort of this tension, and to get rid of it, like destroying ourselves through sacrifice is one way that we can do that. And that's what the death drive fundamentally is.
So Neil, on that note, I mean, would you say that for Freud then that sort of initial like tension or excitation like functions initially as an excess, and like that's like, would you say that like Freud starts from that idea as well?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought this out or anything.
Yeah. No, we're winging it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I do think that's what Freud's getting at. Ultimately, somebody else is going to chime in there.
Where was that quote coming from? Will you show, like, I kind of want to like read back through it just so
bottom of 110.
Bottom of 110. Okay, cool, thanks. I kind of want to, I mean, I'm not backtracking so much as just to like mention the section before, because we kind of jumped like pretty far ahead in the reading. But the section before talks about like where in inventing forms of waste. McGowan sort of highlights the way that in capitalism, utility, right? There's like a myth of utility that like there's always this basis upon which we justify our participation in capitalism, like through this idea of utility, especially like economists, right? Like they talk about the utility within capital, but it's sort of like this mythos. And he kind of tries to make examples of how things that actually serve like a useful purpose, like say food production, are not good commodities to invest in, because in general, if you have a surplus of those commodities, you end up affecting the demand for the commodity, right? And then you can have like a price drop in a commodity that that you have too much of. Like if you have an overabundance of a certain kind of food, then the price of that food goes down.
Well, that's why there was a story about like all the excess groceries, like once coronavirus hit, and like corporations and producers were just destroying massive amounts of food while people were starving. So the prices didn't just like fall through the floor. Mm-hmm. So I mean, anyway, I mean, I just think to me that's like a really relevant and really, I think, perfect example of that.
Yeah, and then he was kind of even saying that like somebody like Keynes would talk about how sacrificial commodities, right? Like what we might call sacrificial commodities, ones that don't have specifically like a utility, but are just made for the purposes of like enjoyment, for like wine, for example, right? Like you don't need wine to survive. And overabundance of wine there will always be an extreme amount of demand for wine. Like it doesn't matter how much wine there is, like people will always pay a certain price for it, right? And like he was kind of saying that the better commodity is one that actually doesn't have a utility. Like the commodities that you should invest in are ones that are just like superfluous to our needs. And so, yeah, I don't know. I feel like this relates in some way to what you were talking about with excess, and I just like am like failing on how to actually connect it. But I feel like
all I'll say is you should ask the wine moms of the world whether wine is a completely unnecessary commodity. So,
and with regard to was Bataille the one that did the solar anus?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. He has an essay called "The Solar Anus." Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty sure that's it.
I was actually just thinking Donna's been kind of silent, and then the only thing he chimes in is to confirm that Bataille wrote "The Solar Anus." I'm posting a link in the show notes for "The Solar Anus." Please go check it out.
Yeah. I was just gonna say it's the other side of the baby and the sun from the Teletubby. Where it's like
I thought you were gonna go with the Star Child from 2001.
Oh yeah, that's fucking. Sorry. Anyway,
well, I will say though.
Wipe me, daddy.
All right, come, daddy. I need help wiping. So. Neil, you have really poisoned the rest of this series with that phrase, man.
You're never gonna hear it. You're never gonna hear it more than when you hear it from us.
That is probably true.
Sure
I will say though, like I'm gonna attempt to actually relate the solar anus to this text.
Fuck yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so like the whole idea of the solar anus, like at first it's like weird and kind of perverse, right? But actually like Bataille's whole like conceptualization of like economic exchange and like how production and consumption work are grounded very much in, I think, what he would call sort of like the excrement of like the universe. So the whole reason he calls the solar anus like the solar anus is because the idea is that the sun is beaming like rays and like, you know, molecules and like all this stuff like to us as a planet, and he sees it as actually the sun like excreting these things, like almost like an anus, like actually like shitting. And so like his conceptualization of it is that it is this like excess, it is this like excremental excess that is the genesis of all life on earth, like because we depend on it to exist. And so it's actually, I think, a pretty interesting idea, because like Bataille's conception of how production and sacrifice and excess work is that it's really about the sort of way that excess comes from excrement, which, I mean, you know, take that for what you will. I know this isn't a Bataille episode, but I do think it's actually a really interesting idea, and I think it's related to why Bataille finds like enjoyment and sacrifice and excess. It has to do with this way he conceptualizes like the ontology of exchange, like on like a material bodily level almost. And he's also perverse as shit, and it's great.
That was in The Dispossessed, right? Where excess is excrement, I think was one of the sayings on the anarchist moon utopia.
Yeah, damn, callback to the Dispossessed episode. Go check that out, y'all. It was a nice job plugging one of your own episodes, Neil. Pro podcaster right there. I'm actually shocked. We're almost at the end of this chapter, and it is not 3 hours.
Yeah,
so
we didn't go way over. I think we're like pretty much here at the end. I mean, I don't know if you guys want to say something about the terrorist piece. I mean, I think it's pretty interesting.
Before we get into that, I wanted to say one other thing here, right? And I know I'm harping on this point, but like what capitalism does, and I think that this is the thing about it that if I could get people to get this, I feel like I would have done something really cool. Capitalism represses the death drive, right? And when something is repressed, we it's like it's not there, but it is. That's the thing, right? And so the death drive is there, it is functioning, but capitalism is the repressive mechanism that makes it seem as though it were not there, that removes it from our awareness, that makes it so that we don't see what we're doing. And I think that is super important. This isn't something that McGowan gets into, and I was kind of surprised by that actually. But one of the kind of like key components of psychoanalysis, as I understand it and practice it, is that what you're going to do is you're going to kind of like sever people from their enjoyment. You're going to cut away their ability to enjoy things in the way that they enjoy them. So you kind of like implicate people in their jouissance, and in doing that, they can't enjoy things in the same way. So earlier, Adam, when you were talking about like the college humor sketch, like that was one of the things I was thinking about, right? What was going on here is they were enjoying things, and then they basically cut away their ability to continue enjoying it, which meant they had to do something different. What I think the project of this text is I read it, and this might be a misreading, but as I read it, it is to cut away people's enjoyment in the system of capitalism. I don't think that McGowan is necessarily advocating a revolutionary overthrow of capitalism. I don't think he's saying that we need to like burn it to the ground. I think he's saying what we need to do is we need to implicate ourselves in what it is that we are enjoying, in our sacrificial things that we do. And it's that we are sacrificing and we are enjoying it. And if we become, if that gets interpreted, then we aren't able to enjoy it maybe in the same way that we did previously to it being interpreted. And that kind of cuts away that jouissance in a way that might be, might have a really positive effect, I think. So that was the last thing I was going to kind of toss in there.
Neil, can I ask you one follow-up question about that real fast?
Sure.
So to be implicated, would you say, well, I'm wondering, how can we understand the relationship to like us and like our death drive and jouissance? Like if we're implicated, like how would you conceptualize how that would then change our relationship? Would it actually be like we're actually subjects that somehow do have some awareness of like our death drive and like are somehow like, if not fully giving ourselves over to it, but we can somehow relate to it in a way that no longer needs to be covered over, the way that capitalism represses it as like a structural necessity?
Maybe. I'll try to give an example. So earlier on, you made a reference to cancel culture, right? Mm-hmm. I'm going to try to use that as my example here. When imagine that there's somebody who, listens to this show that we're doing now, gets really angry about something that one of us have said. There's probably a lot of things that could make people angry, right? And they go on a we're going to cancel Red Library, and Neil and Alex and Don and Adam,
hell yeah,
cancel them hard, right?
We deserve it.
What they're
That's how
doing,
we know we've succeeded.
Yeah,
we get canceled.
That's the whole point of the show. Is to get
we've been
canceled.
trying to do this for a long time, guys. Somebody please cancel us.
Sorry, Neil, keep going.
That's all right. So, but when the person's going on their cancel crusade, they believe that they're doing something just, something virtuous, something good, right? Mm-hmm. At least in the way that I'm imagining, that's what they're doing here. That's part of why they're doing it. And Don, they're doing it because of the other too. The other's going to really approve of their, attempting to cancel us, right? Mm-hmm. And they're enjoying the approval of the other, and they're enjoying the feeling righteous and what's going on here. Now, I've actually worked with individuals who have tried to cancel people and whatnot, and I will actually say that what they're enjoying is the violence that they're inflicting upon the people that they're canceling. Effectively, I don't know exactly how I would say this, mind you, but there's jouissance and death drive in, you're canceled, I'm gonna destroy you. That's jouissance, that's death drive. I think that you can make people realize that that's what they're doing, and if they actually do realize that, then I do think that it changes the way that they can that enjoyment functions in their life. I think that they can't enjoy it in the same way, right? And what you attempt to do is you attempt to psychoanalytically, you attempt to get people sort of they're being pulled into the black hole of jouissance, and what you're trying to do is to introduce another thing, a desire, and that desire can get them to not be sucked into the black hole of jouissance anymore. It can kind of put them into sort of a better orbit around it. So instead of saying you're canceled, I'm going to destroy you, it's actually saying to somebody who you don't like something they did or something that they said, and it's saying to them, hey, that thing that you said, the way that you said it, I kind of have some questions I'd like to ask you about that, and I would like to engage you in a real discourse around some of my thoughts around this. Right now, you're actually talking with the person, and you might even have the capacity to change their mind, right, or have your own mind changed in that process, right? And instead of the jouissance, which is aimed at destruction, the destruction of the individual, now the desire is aimed at changing the relationship that individual has with something, and that's what I think happens in that psychoanalytic process when it works. And I think that this book that McGowan has written is an excellent example of an interpretation that's trying to sort of cut away the jouissance that we have in relationship to our participation in capitalism and the destruction that capitalism creates, and to mobilize us around a desire to do something different.
I have to tell you, I remember whenever we first started this series, we had this discussion about whether psychoanalysis as a method works outside of just the therapy room. And in some ways, exactly what you're describing, Neil, is kind of a perfect answer of how would it look to engage in psychoanalysis as a method that isn't just limited to the one-on-one individual or group therapy. I mean, essentially this book is the method. Engaging in reading and thinking about it in this way is a demonstration of this is what the psychoanalytic process could look like outside of actually the relationship of the analyst and the analysand, I think.
Well, I'm gonna interject because I think that I appreciate what you guys are saying about the clinical approach to analysis and kind of changing people's perspective on things that they have these feelings of jouissance about and trying to reorient that.
You got a dagger behind your back, don't you?
Yeah, I gotta
bring it out. Just show me the blade. Show me the scimitar before you cut my fucking head off.
Alex is going to say this because I think that I'm hardcore in the Miller corner, and I think that you're kind of hardcore in the Zizek.
Oh,
right?
yeah. I have to bring it up because I agree that in certain cases this is appropriate, right? Like you were saying, Neil, when you do have someone that comes in and sort of describes their relationship to jouissance in that way, I think there's absolutely things you can do to intervene in that, like them falling into that pit, like you were saying. But, you know, what it reminded me of immediately when we were first of all, I wanted to just call back. We were talking about the solar anus, and like all I could see in my head was like fucking like Tyler Durden being like, "You are the all singing, all dancing crap of the world." You know, remember he says that? And like, I don't know, I couldn't get that image out of my head. But anyway, so it reminded me immediately when we were talking about this college humor thing that we've kind of been elucidating this whole time, and the way that like somebody sort of constantly intervening in your ability to just experience that jouissance of like, you know, enjoyment and destruction, and like kind of reminding you like there's this like supplemental aspect to this that you're disavowing that's allowing you to enjoy yourself right now. Back in 1995, I had to look it up because I didn't really know how long ago this was, but back in 1995, Dennis Leary, the comedian, had this song that he made. He's like a stand-up comedian, but he had a song that he recorded and made.
I'm an asshole.
And it's called I'm an Asshole.
I'm an asshole.
And it is like the perfect embodiment of the subject that specifically derives the enjoyment from knowing how horrible the things that they're doing are, and tries to fly in the face of like contemporary, like politically correct culture. And so I just kind of wanted to read some lyrics from this song. I mean, it starts off and it says, "Folks, I'd like to sing a song about the American dream, about me, about you, and the way our American hearts beat down in the bottom of our chests." And, you know, he goes on. But then there's this line. He's like talking about how much of an asshole he is. Like he pees on the seat of like public toilets just so that people will sit in them, like sit on his pee. He like, you know, I like this line. He says, "You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get myself a 1967 Cadillac Eldorado convertible, hot pink with whale skin hubcaps and all leather cow interior and big brown baby seal eyes for headlights. And I'm going to drive around in that baby at 115 miles per hour, getting 1 mile per gallon, sucking down quarter pounder cheeseburgers from McDonald's." And he just like goes on. He said in non-biodegradable styrofoam containers. "And when I'm done sucking down those greaseball burgers, I'm going to wipe my mouth with the American flag, and then I'm going to toss the styrofoam container right out the side, and there ain't a goddamn thing anybody can do about it. You know why?" And he says, "Because we got the bombs, that's why." I don't really know. He goes on to like talk about nuclear weapons, but
Let's just skip over that part.
yeah, don't worry about that. I mean, maybe this relates to the terrorism section, in the sense that you can be a complete reactionary in this way, right? It's this sort of like boomer ideology, like, oh, your sensibilities, like, I'm gonna say fuck you, and like I'm gonna do all of the bad stuff that you hate because I want to piss you off, liberal kind of thing. And like, you know, I think that maybe it is in bad faith that these people think that they're gaining enjoyment from the overt knowledge that what they participate in has this subversive dimension. But I think that for some people, it truly is just like what gives them the greatest pleasure, and it's conscious. You know, like they know that it's because it's bad that they're getting. I mean, it's like, you know, I you know, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say that because I don't want to like implicate myself in, you know, I don't want to disclose. I'm gonna pull a Comrade Commissar Don and just like not disclose any information about myself. I don't want anybody to ask any questions, but yeah, I don't know. I get never mind. Just cut that part out. But I guess like my thing is that, right? Like there are absolutely like this implication in the structure of desire, right? Of like having this absence and then kind of filling it in with an object that, you know, can be its stand-in, generates both sides of, it's like generates both political formulations, right? Like you can be on the side of like there are ethical concerns that we have in the world, and we want to be able to like sort of recognize when we're participating versus when we're not participating, and try to intervene in our endorsement of like unethical things. But then there is like absolutely the opposite political perspective that those things are irrelevant and what matters is elsewhere. And in a sense, it creates the same kind of like jouissance from specifically participating in the subversive elements themselves. And an intervention in that space would have to look different. It couldn't just be along the same lines of like trying to remind someone of the ethical injustices, right? Or the ethical injustices. Anyway, sorry, go ahead, Neil. I know you've been trying to say something.
No, but that's the idea of the psychoanalytic interpretation comes in there, because a good interpretation, when if you're in analysis and your analyst makes a good interpretation, it'll rock you. Like you will not feel good after, and because it cuts. And what does it do? It cuts away what you're enjoying. So in the example that you gave, the Leary example, right? Like, I mean, I'm making this up to kind of prove a point here. But I think an effective analytic interpretation would be, you're really good at allowing those liberals to control you, period. Yeah. Right. And then the person be like, are you fucking high? Like, did you not hear what I said? Like, I'm doing all these things and they can't stop me. And then, maybe you say something like, I think you're doing it because you want them to try to stop you. So, I mean, and if you're doing something to piss somebody off, they're the one that's making you do it. Right. And that's that implication, in the Jouissance there.
Absolutely.
The hope would be that they wouldn't be able to enjoy it in the same way.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just to say that's why like id pol and like a lot of these sort of philosophical, like cancel culture, there's like philosophical perspectives that people take are just as reactionary. In a sense, there's like this debate about what is reactionary, right? But I think that's like a perfect example of what it means to be reactionary, right? Is to like structure your whole basis of like being on, just like being in complete retaliation to somebody else's perspectives.
I was gonna say, at some point, if you guys want, like, I could tell you a personal story about a time an analyst like fucking destroyed me with an interpretation.
Well, I
definitely want to hear that.
Well, I actually just wanted to pose two quick things, and then I feel like I really want to hear this story. So one, if Dennis Leary is listening to this episode, he's fucking rocked so hard right now. Just shook.
The liberals made your career, Leary.
But two, we do know what reactionary means. It's being a capitalist rotor in China, like during the era of Deng Xiaoping. That's what being a reactionary is. Capitalist rotor in China during Deng's era. So three,
I don't even know.
It's funny. I went so deep into the ideology of like weird left stupid politics shit that like the joke is just not, there's no structure for it to land. That's fine. So, but the third thing I would say is that whenever we're talking about like the interpretation has to cut, right? I mean, isn't there some aspect of how we're discussing all of this in the psychoanalytic frame is that part of like Leary's enjoyment of being the perverse subject is unconscious, right? Like, isn't there some element of like what you're trying to do is pull the unconscious in and implicate him consciously and like, hey, do you realize like this is what's going on? Like, this is part of what you're doing and you're enjoying it because of this. Is that... I'm wondering if y'all would agree with that. Like, that's also has to be a necessary element. It's like part of the interpretation has to cut to the level of the unconscious. And a lot of what like woke, like cancel culture, id pol stuff does is it never like goes there. It just always operates at the level of the conscious. And that's why you can continue to be a perverse subject and be like, oh, fuck you. I'm just going to double down and be even more like, outlandish and like offensive. Like, because
like for example, wanting to ban certain words from like, colloquial speech, right? Like you can't say, I feel like this is like a trend like maybe 5-6 years ago, but it's like, you can't say words like bossy to like little girls because bossy is like a stand-in for bitchy, and like women are not supposed to be in assertive positions, according to patriarchal values. And therefore, when you call like a little girl bossy, what you're actually doing is trying to punish her for having an assertive or like leadership type of role in a situation, and that's wrong for their like developmental psychology and shit. And that there's like all kinds of examples of this, like don't use the R word, right, when talking about intellectually disabled people, right? Like you can't just say the R word. Well, in a sense, this is like, and I think this is right along the same lines of what we're talking about. Like, yeah, you can ban the word, but the meaning that the word carries, and to all the people who still want to imply that meaning, the word will just change. The signifier of the same meaning will just shift. And in a sense, this is what psychoanalysis is trying to do, right? It's trying to shift the meaning in a positive way away from something that otherwise was destructive to a person's like experiences, right? You're trying to kind of do specifically what would happen if you were to ban the word, like somebody would just come up with something else to represent the same thing. It's like doing the opposite, right? Like shifting the meaning inherent to the word so that when it's expressed or when it's experienced by someone, it no longer carries that jouissance along with it that causes them the destruction in their life, right? So it's like almost like an exact opposite, operation that you're trying to accomplish in psychoanalysis, if I understand correctly. And I don't know. I think that's an interesting example of that kind of.
It's cutting away the repression of the enjoyment, actually.
Yeah, that's Mm-hmm.
The repression of the enjoyment?
Yeah, because you enjoy something, but you repress your enjoyment of it, right? That's what's going on. So like the Leary guy is repressing his enjoyment. He's repressing that he needs the liberals in order to have the enjoyment, right? And so like that's under the repression barrier. So if you cut that away, it's not protected by it, and you're now implicated in the enjoyment, right? So it changes the structure of it.
And that's what has to be absent for him to enjoy it, is like the liberals have to be the shadows in the background that are necessary for him to actually persist in that like sort of repressed enjoyment that he's getting.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So Neil, do you want to share the interpretation that rocked your shit?
This is on this podcast, it's weird because I think that people might not like this. So I'm in analysis, and I'm also trying to like become an analyst, and I'm a therapist, and I'm seeing people. And one of the things that I have talked a lot about in my analysis is my desire, as I was framing it, to provide analysis to people who can't afford it. And that I still think is something that I still continue to desire to do. But I'm also talking about like people who charge too much and how they basically are dicks for doing that, and so on and so forth. So I'm kind of like railing against them and all this. And at one point, the analyst says something along the lines of, "I think you really enjoy money a lot more than you think." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? I don't enjoy money." And he's like, "Right, you think you enjoy not having money." But I mean, he's like, you even at one point I think I used the word demonic to describe money.
Ooh, interesting.
As a demonic influence or something. And he's like, there's a lot of poor people who would absolutely love to have that demon in their life. And it was just like,
fuck,
ouch.
I got a little rocked hearing you say that.
And he's like, this thing that you think is so bad is something that do you think it's so bad that you don't want the poor people to have it? Or do you just want the poor people to be poor? I mean, like, are you a friend of poverty? Sort of like, there's an implication there. I mean, this got pushed in a lot of different ways. But one of the other things that he said at one point is he's like, I'm going to point out that you're putting, he's like, well, you don't want money. You're getting paid off in your ability to be smugly satisfied and how righteous you are. And you're doing that at the cost of your own family. Like, for you to feel good about yourself, your family doesn't have the ability to have financial security or to be able to enjoy things that are probably good for them to enjoy.
Whew.
Yeah.
That is a spicy / ice cold motherfucking take, as we say here on Red Library. Damn. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
I mean, this is I'm really condensing some stuff here in the telling of the story, but I mean that's one of the things that I think different about psychoanalysis, right? Psychoanalysis is largely about like I'm repressing the enjoyment that I derive from kind of like keeping myself in a certain position. And the position I described is this like righteous sort of like, leftist person who has these values. And because I am loyal to these values and these causes, then that means I'm not like tainted by the evil of money. But it's not that simple ultimately, right? Like there's another enjoyment that's going on here. And there's also something else that I really want. And that's the enjoyment that I was repressing, my own desire to have money. In this instance, it's there. And it's exerting an influence on me, and the repression was sort of like I think whittled away through this process, right? So like I mean, you come out of those. I came out of those sessions anyways. Like I mean, I had a lot to think about, right? I mean, I felt as if my ability to kind of continue to like pat myself on the back for being such a wonderfully concerned person about the plight of the poor and whatnot I wasn't able to enjoy it in the same way. That enjoyment was no longer available to me. And that meant that I had to do something different, right? I had to change my relationship to what it is that I was enjoying and how I was enjoying it. And I think that McGowan is attempting to perform a similar operation with this book, right? When the way that he's rendered this text, and he's kind of like implicating you and me and all the people who read it in the way that we enjoy capitalism.
Damn. Yep. Real shit. So Neil, can I ask you one follow-up question? I'm curious how you could describe the change in the relationship to what you enjoyed after having that analysis.
Yeah, I probably could. It would just take a long time.
Well, we can talk about that later, but I mean, yeah, if there's ever a point you'd want to like describe that, because I feel like, if that's the point of this book, that's McGowan's approach, is to sort of like engage us in that process. It might be interesting because one of the things I thought about is like, so I could see someone hearing that story and say, okay, so if we could then, let's say, direct that at the sort of a lot of the general projects of like left radical revolutionary politics, right? like I could see someone bucking against that interpretation very, very hard and saying, so like, should we just then be capitalist subjects and like not really engage ourselves in radical like revolutionary efforts to change the world, or
I was about to
like
say,
resist capitalism?
If I could just say a quote really quick,
do it
to kind of embody that. Reading this like literally like just like the last lines of this chapter. Well, I'll start on the page before a little bit. This violent revolt rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of how capitalism sustains itself. He's referring to like terrorist acts right now. One need not turn to terrorism in order to rediscover the spirit of sacrifice. The spirit is never left. Every act that we perform in the capitalist system involves us in forms of sacrifice, even if the system renders them invisible. So instead of flying a plane into a building, all one need to do to experience the most violent sacrifice is to buy a new iPhone. Which, in a sense, that left me with, I think that's probably why my notes were just like, don't terrorism, guys, K, thanks, bye. Mm-hmm. This was like, basically like that left me with a sense of like, what? Okay, so what are you advocating for then? That like, we just accept that our sacrifice is already present in the actions that we're performing and just not be so bothered by it so that we don't fall into this reactionary fervor that might cause us to do something terroristic. And so obviously that's not, I don't think that's McGowan's implication, but I think that leaving this topic in that way and just kind of being like, don't fly a plane into a building. What you do already involves enough sacrifice for it to be recognized. I mean, I know he's already criticizing Bataille and this whole idea of trying to re-engage with the sacrifice that we lost from like older organizations of society, but like still, it's an odd notion to leave end this chapter on, to just be like, you don't need to sacrifice any more than you're already sacrificing.
Or is it to like just recognize like how you are always I'm going to use that phrase, you are always already sacrificing in capitalism, and like that's what he wants us to recognize, to then sort of deny us that like repressed enjoyment of the destructive act.
Well, but like, aren't there destructive acts that would still be in a sense revelatory of the way that capitalism is oppressive and exploitative? I'm not arguing for terrorism necessarily.
Let's keep it real 100, since this is kind of the theme of tonight's show.
Yeah, this is I think it's a pretty revolutionary podcast, right? So
I mean, if you think about, the first thing that jumps to mind for me is the Red Army faction, like in West Germany, East Germany, like in the 70s through the 80s, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the nature of a group like the Red Army faction is precisely to engage in this sort of like radical, violent, and if you were to ask them at the time, like to say, like if you were to try to analyze them and like give them this knee shaking interpretation, right, of like, oh, do you realize that actually like this isn't just about like your morals and like you being able to like have this like, like you being this like pure ethical revolutionary subject. It's like you're actually enjoying this in a way that like you're not consciously recognizing. And not only that, but there's a way that like the enjoyment you're really getting is that you get to be a martyr. It's like you get to destroy yourself, pure death drive, like pure jouissance. Like a lot of those people ended up in prison. A lot of them were killed by the state and by police. I mean, there is an element where you can look at efforts like that and to actually recognize like there is an intense amount of enjoyment in that. I think this is one of the weird things of how, you see some like people on the left and like, basically like, I really think that you and your family and all of you are going to be put up against the wall, and I can't wait for that day to happen. And it's just like, damn, like, what are we really talking about here? Because it just seems like you really have this like destructive drive to like enjoy being in the place of like sort of dispensing systematic violence in a way that you feel is like denied to you, But I mean, I think there are real questions here that like are useful to ask about like more radical revolutionary left political like approaches and also historical movements. And I think also to like ask a question of like, okay, so like what is the relationship to like a more radical revolutionary perspective on capitalism that also like can recognize how this enjoyment that we get can be repressed and sort of operate in all these fucked up weird ways, and it's really about death drive and jouissance. Like, how is there a way to recognize that and still somehow like change your relationship to the necessity of like a revolutionary sort of like need to like challenge capitalism? Because I mean, believe me, I love McGowan. I love McGowan's project. I look up to him and Ainley and their work immensely. And I'm also at the end of the day asking like, is disinvesting from capitalism really enough? Yeah. Like, is that really enough?
He talks about this. This is way before we are now on page 13, actually, right? So I'm going to try to pull this up.
Do it.
As long as radical politics operates with the belief that revolution will remove some of the prevailing repression, it accepts the ruling idea of capitalism and buys into the fundamental capitalist fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
No revolution can transform dissatisfaction into satisfaction.
Yes.
This is how revolution has been conceived throughout its entirety of the capitalist epoch. The Revolutionary Act has to be thought differently. The Revolutionary Act is simply the recognition that capitalism already produces the satisfaction that it promises.
I'm glad you brought up an older quote, because this is exactly what I love about us doing this series, is that I want us to like keep coming back and like trying to integrate and think through this, because that is exactly the question I would ask, is that, you know, this in some ways, Neil, reminds me of what we talked about, I think, on the first Lost Horizons network episode, where we basically said, well, what do you mean when you say revolution? And we all went around and tried to describe that. And I think actually something that, you know, you have talked about, that I know I just like fucking wrote a blog post about it that was trying to grapple with this, is like, what would it look like, or like, how do you conceptualize like a utopia or like quote unquote revolution that does not offer any like utopian hope of like completely resolving dissatisfaction? Like, and to conceptualize that differently. And I think what McGowan's talking about is a fundamental element of that. Maybe it's like, this is more of like an exploratory sort of question I'm asking, is like how do we unpack that and then really think the Revolutionary Act differently, that doesn't still offer the hope of like resolving of all dissatisfaction or like resolving of all contradictions. So, I mean, this is one of the reasons why Frederick Jameson and his stuff on the American Utopia, I think, disagree with it, but it's really interesting because he's trying to do this. And I think it's not something that really many people are trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say the next chapter, right? Obviously, this is getting towards the end of this episode, but the next chapter talks a lot about God, our conceptions of authority, and like ideas of freedom. And I think that once we get into that discussion, there are a lot of ways in which criticizing the idea of the kind of freedom that capitalism affords us and recognizing the way that freedom really could look is kind of touching on this exact same subject, right?
Sure.
Of like the radicality of like being decisive, right? When you have actual freedom that isn't just sort of like a drunken game of this or that, you know, that capitalism gives us. You know, it has this quality of exactly putting us in that position of like not vouchsafing any of the decisions that we might make fully. It's almost like I think Zizek kind of has this adage a lot of the time. He mentions it, where it's like you know, on the money, on our money currency, it says in God we trust, you know, and he kind of always likes to turn it around and say like no, like the implications of psychoanalysis say that God trusts you, you know, and that basically it's your ethical responsibility rests solely in your ability to make a decision and follow through with it, and that there's no big other that's going to guarantee for you that the decision you make will be correct or will be sanctioned. But capitalism accustoms us to an environment where we are free to make all the decisions in the world, right? This like sort of permissive utopia that we live in, like quote unquote utopia is not a real utopia, but you know, it affords us this permissivity on condition that none of the enjoyment or none of the things that we really pursue are going to be able to have that gravity of like our own decision making that would implicate like some real form of radical like Kantian freedom. So yeah, anyway, that's all I have to say about that.
Don't want to, I mean, we're at like 2 hours. So any final thoughts? Don, you've been shockingly quiet this episode.
Yeah.
Damn it, Don.
I can explain after the episode.
Okay. So I don't know, like I don't stab me because I refrained, but I'm going to mention it now. I almost like implicated Don in being a reactionary and refusing to ask the questions he normally asks this episode. And like, Don, are you being reactionary right now? Like, are you refusing to ask the questions? But anyway.
And it's interesting, like how all of us then were like kind of rocked by that. I know I kept looking at Don and I was like, Don, are you going to say something? Like, where's your question at, man? Come on.
But anyway.
I don't know. Any final thoughts? Neil, do you have any other liquid hot fire you want to drop?
Man, I don't have anything right now. No, I'm looking for a quote, and you caught me in the midst of doing that. So I got nothing. I'm gonna say I got nothing right now.
All right. Y'all, I thought this was a good one. I thought
It's a good one.
I had a really good working through of this chapter. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I was actually a little worried because there were a lot like large sections of this chapter that I kind of was just like, okay, yeah, whatever, like coltan mining, whatever, you know, just like get on with it. What are we talking about here? You know,
I'll make sure I put that in the episode.
This should be the opener.
Alex is like, all right, listen, I'm going to open this episode by just saying I don't give a shit about those kids in the coltan mines in the Congo, okay? Just pure perversity.
No, but it was very productive, and I'm glad it was.
It's a good one.
To adopt a capitalist term, it was very productive.
It was very productive.
Yeah.
It was very synergistic.
Fuck you. Get out.
All right. Don, final thoughts. Final questions.
No, I'm good.
All right. That's it. Don, the big other of the show, has spoken. No other questions, no other thoughts.
Don, come wipe me.
Daddy Don, come wipe me, please.
Zaddy Don.
Zaddy Don, come wipe me. You knew you weren't getting out of here unscathed. You can refrain from questions. You can be silent all you want. You're still getting pulled in. All right, y'all. So I guess we're on to God in the next chapter, also led by CC Alex whenever we do that one. And then it'll be CC Don up next, and then I'll be bringing us up on the tail end.
Yep.
I'm ready.
We are going to, in the true spirit of Samuel Beckett, we're going to fail again, but fail better next time.
Yes.
All right.
Capitalism's collective fail sons.
That's who we are. Capitalism's collective fail sons. Like the younger ones who just completely are just simping off of the economy and really not doing shit. So, all right, y'all. Well, good work. Godspeed. Good night. Good luck. We love you all. Except for CC Don. CC Don loves no one. All right. We'll catch y'all next time. Ah yes, time indeed is a flat circle. Sometimes it do be like that. We're gonna get out of here for the week. Again, thanks for tuning in each and every week to Red Library for all of our theoretical shenanigans, analytical deep dives, icy cold takes, spicy motherfucking takes, everything we can throw at you week in and week out here on the show. Next week, we're going to be taking the week off as our exclusive patron-only episode is going to be out, but you can expect a free teaser if you are not currently a patron of Red Library, and this one is very, very special. We had a roundtable discussion with patrons, with some of our Lost Horizons network crew, and a very special guest from Minnesota who joined the roundtable so we could talk all about the global protests around racist violence, police violence, not only here in the US but also internationally, and hopefully trying to carve out some various ways to analyze some of the implications of the political moment we're in the framework of dialectical pessimism. So it was a very special one, and we think we're going to be doing a lot more of these roundtable type discussions with our patrons here in the future. So remember, head over to our Patreon. $1 a month. That's all it is. We try to keep it accessible. Until we catch you back here next time in a few weeks for a free wide release episode, remember, stay hydrated, stay motivated, stay liberated. Keep searching for those lost futures. Stay safe. Remember, mask on, and only when you're home, fuck it, mask off. Just keep those straight. It's very easy to get those confused. Mask on outside, mask off inside. I hear the future flute riff playing through my head. Maybe I'll paste that in, maybe I won't. I don't want to get sued. Until next time, just remember, your comrades over here at Red Library, your podrads at the Lost Horizons Network, we out here. Red Library out. Peace.